Now I'm going to tell you a story about flying with W1 and W2 on a formation ride. W1 was one of my students, and W2 was a classmate of his. At the time, both were on special monitoring status. They both were considered marginal students. W1's issues were not so much stick and rudder as they were knowing the procedures. And that really came to light on this mission. Actually, on this particular mission, he had been unsatted earlier for formation lead takeoff, and that's what we were doing. We were in the lead aircraft, and W2 was on our right wing. Now, the procedure for a formation takeoff in T-38s was, once we were in position, the leader would look back at his wingman, and if the wingman was ready to go, he would nod his head, at which time the leader would give the run-up signal, the signal for the wingman to run the engines up to military power and check that they were performing accordingly. And once the leader checked his engine instruments, he'd look back. If the wingman were ready, he would again nod his head, at which time the leader would tap his helmet, put his head back, bring the head forward, at the same time releasing brakes and going into afterburner. Relatively straightforward for most folks. At any rate, we get out on the runway, we get into position, and W1 was wanting to do well on this ride. So we get into position, and he says, "Well, sir," he says, "are you ready to go?" And I said, "You bet." So he starts to spool them up. And I said, "What about our wingman?" And he goes, "Oh, crap." So he brings the throttles back, and he looks over at the wingman. However, what had happened as I was saying this is I looked back at W2 and I gave him the run-up signal, to which point W2 had run the engines up and was in the process of checking them. The nose wheel strut on W2's airplane was about that big, and his jet was kind of dancing around over there on the wing position. And W1 says, "Sir, he's not looking at me." Well, that's because he was checking his engine instruments. I said, "Don't worry, he'll figure it out. Let's just go ahead and run him up." So W1 runs him up to military power, and then he starts in. RPM is 99.0 to 100.5. EGT is 630 to 640. Jesus, come on. Usually what we would do is just look at the engine instruments and scan that they both were kind of parallel and kind of look normal. I look back at W2 at this point. He was looking at our aircraft, and I swear I could see the whites of his eyes through his dark helmet visor because his legs were tied up in knots from holding the brakes and military power for all this time. Anyway, W1 then makes the announcement that the engine instruments look good, and he says, "Are you ready to go?" And I said, "You bet." He releases brakes and slams them into AB, and oh, crap. So I look back at W2, and I start this motion here like, "Come on with us." And at the same time I said, "What about our wingman?" To which W1 says, "Oh, shit." Now he pulls the engine instruments back to idle. W2 goes blowing by us, and I take the jet at that time and push him back into AB, afterburner, and begin a tail chase with him. We get about halfway down the runway, I suppose, and W1 says, "Well, sir," he says, "this is where I probably failed this ride." And I said, "You bet." And we went off, and to the best of my knowledge, I had a pretty good flight that day. Thanks for tuning in.